Will Rezin, welcome to the Thought Room. So happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I feel like this interview has been a long time coming for many reasons. One, it was like your name just kept being brought up to me, which I have to tell you is a good sign for your reputation. This is kind of a funny synchronicity, and we were just talking about synchronicities before we hit record because you actually just met my partner like the last week, and he had no idea that you were about to be on my show in a week. And but I believe the first time I heard about your work was through Melissa Stengel. So it's funny.
Oh.
I don't know if you knew this, but I went back in my emails the other day. And you and I had emailed back and forth like 6 months ago.
Did we really?
Yeah, seriously. I know. It blew my mind because so I had just opened myself up publicly to begin one-on-one coaching at that time, like probably that very same week that I emailed you. And you were just starting one of your groups.
So this would have been last fall.
Yes.
In the fall of 2020.
And what's the title of that?
Trauma and Somatics.
Trauma and Somatics. And so obviously, Mel and I have a great relationship because this podcast was started down at Soltara Healing Center. I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't.
So I was invited down there to do a social media exchange before this podcast had ever gone live. So it was like this kind of obscure thing. It was just a concept. And they invited me down there to effectively interview the guests and influencers and people that were coming through and exchange and work with the medicine weekly. So that was really how Mel and I deepened our relationship. And I was living down there for 3 months, the end of 2019 into the beginning of 2020. So
did you get home right before things happened?
Literally the week that lockdown happened. So I came back, I think it was like the beginning of March, and I was in LA, and this is kind of an aside story, but I think it's interesting. I was in LA doing interviews, and that very weekend, I was supposed to fly to Austin, Texas. Why was I flying to Austin, Texas? Because I had had a vision in ayahuasca that's where my work was bringing me next. And for me, I just trust those things. And then we get word, like 2 days before I'm supposed to fly here, and now I live here, of course, but to check it out for the first time, really, that the world is shutting down. So, of course, the rest of 2020 was sideways, and me sort of having this epic hero's journey to like, I got to get to Austin. I got to fulfill the vision. And so, yeah, this ties together really hilariously because now you're here. I'm still very interested in the work that you're doing with trauma and somatics, and especially your integrity. You know, I've heard you speak on a couple of my friends' podcasts before, including Eric Godzi, and read your website. And there's I want to use the word vibration, but I don't want to sound too woo-woo when I say that because you're actually an incredibly grounded human being. But there is an essence that you carry that rings of truth. So thank you for being here. Will Rezin, so glad to have you on the Thought Room.
Hallie, thank you. Just soaking that in for a moment. It's quite a reflection. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. What an interesting circle to find ourselves here in a conversation and talking about some of the work. And that's where our first point of connection happened.
Absolutely. And throwing it back to Mel Stengel, you know, I think what she's also been a guest on the show, but what she said about you was he's been one of my greatest mentors. I mean, this is a young woman who is helping hundreds and hundreds of people on the monthly, you know, heal with with ayahuasca and through plant medicine. So for her to give you that compliment is quite beautiful. So throwing it to you, kind of dropping into what's at the top of your heart, because there are so many directions that we could go today. But if you tune into what feels like the most gorgeous place for us to begin in your story to segue into your work, what's coming to mind?
I like the word choices there. The most gorgeous place to start at the top of my heart. I was in a float, my fourth float of the week a month ago, and over at a place called the Ocean Lab.
I have a membership there. Shout out to Eric.
Yeah, Eric's amazing. And I have the unlimited membership. I started off going to the sauna daily, and then I was just like, okay, what am I doing? I wonder what would happen if I started incorporating floats a couple times a week. And so I started doing that, and this is one of those weeks where I was in my fourth float of the week. I was in this deep meditative space. I'm also working with a Feldenkrais practitioner who's absolutely out of this world. I mean, if you've never heard of it,
never.
As a modality, it's a body-based modality where we work with the natural intelligence of the body. And
what's it called again?
Feldenkrais. It was created by a guy named Moshe Feldenkrais. And so, you know what? Segue for a moment, just to give context. You know what hammer toe is? It's a person's toes are kind of scrunched up. It looks like they're holding onto the ground.
Right.
Well, I've had that most of my life. And you can see it when I'm showing you my feet right now, but they have straightened out in a way that when I stand now, they don't even look the same.
Okay, this is really weird because we're having another synchronicity, but I've had bunions my whole life. And I used to have so much pain in my feet and numbness and nerviness when I touched them and when I walked around. And I stopped wearing high heels or poor shoes at like 25. I just couldn't. I would not be able to feel my toes for days afterward. And a lot of that has shifted after work with ayahuasca.
Mm-hmm. The nervous system impacts so much.
Not surprisingly. These are all great golden nuggets for your work.
Well, so while working with Pat, I've been exploring my body in a different way. I do body-centered work as well, but a different entry point. And so the gentleman I've been working with, his name's Pat. And after my sessions with him, I like to go get into the float tank because I'm in this weightless state. Most people in the float tanks attempt to hold rigidly still or softly still and lay in this weightless, in the salt and just float around and try to meditate and be still and whatnot. Well, that just didn't feel natural or easy for me at the time. And so I began moving around and exploring movements that a baby would explore. And during one of these float sessions, I'm coming back around to top of my heart. I just, what we might call a download nowadays, or what I might refer to as insight, or some sort of idea or inner knowing struck me. And I haven't had a clear articulation of my purpose in the way that I've wanted that resonant, firm, grounded articulation to be. But it just hit me in that moment. And I can see the ways that this permeates everything that I do in life. And it's this, I'll share it with you, because I think this is what's most relevant, and there is a lot of like joy and beauty in it, in the way that it takes shape in my life. And that's to alleviate suffering. And what came to me was an enormous mission to do that for humanity. And that means everyone. But to discuss this, I have to really be clear about what I mean by suffering. Because most people think when they hear the word suffering, they might think pain.
Right.
They might think discomfort. They might think tension. They might, there's so many things they might think of when they think of suffering. But I'm not talking about those things. Those things are symptoms of something greater. And the suffering I'm referring to is a lack of awareness and presence, a lack of our ability to live in the only thing that is timeless, and that is this moment, this present moment. And my work with trauma has really connected me with the truth of how all roads lead back to the same place, in essence. The mystics talk about ending suffering, but they're not talking about removing pain. They're talking about helping us to be able to be present, to experience what Joseph Campbell called the rapture of being alive. And so that's been my question that I've been in. That's been my curiosity, or maybe not the question, it's been the definition of where I'm heading, right? That signpost somewhere in the future, the objective that's so impossibly big that I'll never accomplish it in my lifetime, but the journey there will make a difference.
This is so beautiful. And thank you so much for sort of delineating the difference between pain and suffering. And I think, what I'm hearing is it's possible to experience pain and to just witness it and to hold it and allow it to sort of pass through our beingness, where suffering, at least for me, comes on when there's a resistance to the pain. And there's like a pushing or a pulling or a pretending it isn't there. And then subsequently, my experience of that is after a chronic amount of time, numbness sets in, or anxiety sets in, or depression sets in.
Yeah, I would agree. Suffering is the resistance to life and the constriction around experience. And to say that another way, when pain comes, do we try to force ourselves to stop noticing it? Or can we allow it to happen and be with it? Right? When joy comes, do we constrict ourselves around it and try to hang on to it? Or do we allow it to move through us? Right? Life is like water, and we have a tendency to try to grab that water and hold on to it as if that's even something that's a thing.
Right.
And to create an analogy here out of that, I believe that trauma is like taking that water and freezing it in an attempt to hold on to the river. Right? But life gets stuck when we do that, but that's not the essence of it. Right?
Wow. Wow. Okay, so you are 39 years old, and
the end of this month.
Okay, you're turning 39. Wow. And you have amassed an impeccable amount of embodied knowledge, and that's clear. What do you think catalyzed this journey for you of your spiritual unfolding, of coming to this big vision, this big dharma, of helping remove suffering from the world? How did this come about?
So I have many thoughts as I'm pausing and I'm just kind of letting it happen inside of me. The thought, I'll just share a couple of them. I think I can meta out and give a meta answer, and then I could also give you the first thing that comes to me is that there's this innate curiosity that I was born with, and I think some of that was cultivated in my childhood and with the context that I grew up in, and the family and the schools and so on. My mother was an art teacher, and I went to a Waldorf school.
So did I.
Yeah.
No way. We didn't watch TV at all in my house. I was barefoot running around all the time.
Same. Yeah. No television until I was 11 years old or so.
I became a Waldorf teacher later in life. Yeah,
oh
man.
My God. How about that? That's freaking amazing.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. My mother later in life became a therapist. But Waldorf was a huge part of my early childhood. And so that curiosity for the world, the wonderment, the play, all of those things were a huge part of my beginning. And the encouragement to explore the world, to explore my imagination and to dream. And I was a natural dreamer anyway. Meditation's never been a thing that's been necessarily what I would call hard for me. It's been being focused in little succinct things might be. I work and I kind of operate differently. So there's a natural disposition, whether that's from my genetics or whether that's from the influence of my environment. I'd say probably both. And in addition to that, I lived through an enormous amount of pain and suffering. And the suffering being my definition that I gave a few moments ago of my resistance to life.
Yeah.
And that lingered on inside of me as body patterns, as muscle patterns, as emotional patterns, as psychological patterns. And I, at the same time, was fascinated with why the world was the way it was, why people did what they did, where we came from, culture, stories, myth, mysteries, and religion, all of that stuff. And so, gosh, from as early as I can remember, because we had books, we didn't have a television. I read stories about adventures and cultures. I was fascinated with ancient cultures. And so that became the thing that, I don't know if it pushed me or there was some sort of pulling towards this where I am now, that coalesced in this. I think it's probably both. But it was a long journey, I'd say. Early childhood was lovely. Lots of good memories from my early childhood. And then teenage years were incredibly difficult.
Starting with when?
So let's see. It was right around the time that I moved to Virginia. We lived all over the place. I was born in Massachusetts and we lived in Pennsylvania and multiple homes in Pennsylvania.
And why were you guys moving around so much?
My father was moving from job to job. We might say climbing the corporate ladder of sorts.
Okay.
Just every couple of years, they'd buy a house, they'd flip it, and he'd find a better job and move up and increase his salary. So, let's see, right around my 10th birthday, we moved to Virginia from Michigan. And that was our 10th house that we'd lived in. And so I learned a lot about flexibility and about the world, about people. Resilience, yeah. So when we moved there, my dad started traveling more. And my mother was teaching. And my mother started struggling with symptoms of PTSD. And back then they wouldn't have diagnosed it that way, but with knowing what I know now, she and I can both look at it and go, yeah, it was undiagnosed PTSD. It was just like stuck trauma responses and whatnot that were cycling, and things were difficult between her and my father. And I don't know all of the details of the specifics. And he was gone a lot. And in that, I was going through puberty. And so there were hormones inside of my body, and I began to push away to individuate. And in that individuation, I resisted the rules, the structure that we lived in. And I grew up in a pretty conservative Christian household, and my father wanted to be a Catholic priest. We would do ritual or ceremony at home, and they'd do like a service. He'd read from the Bible. And so there was a lot of what I at the time perceived as rigidity in our family unit. Things are the way they are, and that's it. We listen to the rules, and that's it. We listen to authority, and that's it. And I didn't like that.
No.
It didn't feel natural. Yeah. And so I started rebelling and pushing against. And I'm imagining that, I'm not a parent right now, and I hope to someday be, but I imagine how difficult it must have been for them as parents, with me challenging their worldview, the structure of living, all of the things that they've known to be true, and really pushing hard. And so in that, I don't think that they were equipped. And so my mother sent me to live in some group homes. And there I was exposed to a different part of the world, a part of the world that I was insulated from. I was very privileged. I mean, we weren't wealthy, but I would say I was privileged in that I was not exposed to as much pain and suffering. I was insulated from it.
Wow.
Prior to that. And then I was directly inserted into the midst of it.
What was that like? I mean, that had to be so discombobulating.
That's such a good word for it.
It's an underused word, I think.
I think so. It is underused. It was scary. It was confusing. I was 12. It was right before I turned 12 when I was sent to the first place. And
were you an only child?
No, I have a younger brother. He's 2 years younger.
Did he get sent?
No.
Just you?
Just me.
You had to have felt like
oh yeah,
it was your fault.
Oh, it was made known that it was my fault. And it was for my own good. And they loved me. And that was why they were doing it. And so that was the narrative.
What the fuck?
Yeah. Well, as with the vantage point of an adult, that has lived through what I've lived through now, I can look back and go, I feel for them. Yeah. They were doing their best.
Yeah.
And they wanted me to know that I was loved. And still they felt that it was important that they did what they did.
Right.
And it was hard at the time. At the time, it was confusing.
That makes me want to cry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a distinct memory of the first couple nights in this place. And my mother sent me, I was insulated from the world. She would sing me songs to sleep at night, both my brother and myself. And she sent me with this tape recorder, a cassette recorder, with a recording of her singing songs so I could listen to them to fall asleep. And being in that environment, there were these people that were there were in so much pain. There's this massive contrast between myself and then this world, this very different world. And I didn't know that world existed. I'd never been exposed to it.
The shock.
It was, yeah. They talked to us about it, but that's different than living in it.
So what happened with the recordings?
Well, I listened to them. At night, I would cry myself to sleep for the first bit. And I was there for, gosh, man, how long was I there? It was off and on for a year, a little more than a year at one of the places. And then I came home.
Wow.
And I still went to school in the same school. But I went on a different bus. And I just started having difficulty with school. But, again, I can look back and go, well, I was living through a traumatic experience. And of course I had difficulty at school. And they medicated me in an attempt to control my behavior, force me to focus, subdue the anger or, the emotions that I was feeling as a result of this experience.
Right. Just tranquilize you out of the natural human experience and response that you were having.
We know that you're scared right now and you're angry and you're sad.
But we need you to not be.
Exactly. Could you just not do that? That makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah. Dude. Yes. I mean, I think it's safe to say you and I are on the same page with a lot of this stuff, and these being the foundational visceral issues with the way that mental health and trauma, PTSD, depression, anxiety are managed currently.
Yeah, I think we missed the mark. We miss a really special opportunity to help our children become the kinds of adults that can be loving and accepting and welcoming to other humans. I've been listening to this lecture by Anthony DeMello, and he quotes a guy.
Which one is it?
It's an 8-hour long. It's the Awareness book.
I've listened to that one.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm like my third time through it.
Yeah.
But he quotes towards the end of it. It's like in the last 15 minutes of it, he talks about this guy, Neil, Neil Summerhill, I think is the guy's name.
Oh, yeah.
And he's talking about this guy who has this school.
Yes.
For children.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. He says, every child has a God within. Our attempt to, hang on, I'm going to pull it up because I don't want to get it wrong. But this speaks to that point that I'm making here of us. It speaks to the point of us missing the mark.
Yes.
Every child has a God in them. Our attempts to mold them turns that God into a devil.
Huh. Yeah.
And what he found was that he would take these kids that were troubled and they were sent to his boarding school. And the ones that were extremely conditioned to be like everybody else, that were the most rebellious, it took him a minimum of 6 months to get out the rebellion. But afterwards, they wanted to learn. They wanted to participate with a group, and no one made fun of anyone. No one gave anyone a hard time. They all existed harmoniously. And the point that he was making in all of this is that our attempt to rigidly control and force behavior is what causes the push against. It's what causes the conflict. It's what trains into us these maladaptive behaviors. This like picking at each other, making fun of each other. And then we all operate with the assumption that that's normal, that's natural, it's our animal nature. But I think it's so far from true.
Yeah.
It's so far from our animal nature.
I love that. I love that example, and I love that quote. And what I'm thinking about in relation to that is this idea of how long it took the children to relax the rigidity that they had been entrained into. And I'm thinking about that in relation to trauma and PTSD and the body keeping the score and the nervous system responding in the way that it does. And even just reflecting back on my own last 12 months, but particularly the last 5 years of my life have been pretty much like getting plummeted in the face with shadow waves, like every 3 to 6 months with large things. And I've had to learn or attempt, sometimes rather ungracefully, to integrate these things on the fly. And what I'm experiencing right now, currently, in the last, maybe 4 weeks of my life, are that things are good and the sailboat is sailing along. Then why does my body feel like everything is wrong? Why do I feel like a piano is about to fall on my head? Business is growing great. The show is growing. I just met an incredible man. We've been together for 3 months. His very existence is allowing me to feel safe processing otherwise unlookable things. It was just like not safe to go into some of those caverns by myself. And him being a doctorate in clinical psych, it's very convenient to be able to have our pillow talk be these like sharings of our most intimate pain. But yeah, I would love to hear your perspective on a traumatized person and you talked a little bit about signs and symptoms. And so it's like, I think people listening to this, at least I'll speak from my perspective. I never thought I had been traumatized. I was like, I had a pretty good childhood and this and that, because I didn't really understand what trauma was or how I was storing it. It's very sneaky the way that it's held. So I would love for you to speak about this first and foremost. What can trauma look like in its most subtle responses? And then from there, I'd love to ask you some practicalities about working on the inner and then working on the external with trauma. Maybe you did things like sauna or diet or like, let's go into all these things and see where we go.
Yeah. You know, what you said there, I didn't think I had trauma. I had a pretty normal life. 100% of us have it as a result of our conditioning and the world, right? And it's not what we think it is. It's not a car accident. It's not a surgery. It's not a rape. It's not physical abuse. It's how our body remembers that. It's the unintegrated stress. It's the resistance to allowing life to flow. I'm being meta about that in that last statement. But trauma really is the bound survival response energy in our body. It's the body's memory. When we think of memory, we think of, I can remember what you said 5 minutes ago. I can remember how to drive here from where I am. I can remember that my birthday is on May 31st.
Right.
I can, and so on and so forth, right? But memory is so different than that. It's just one form of active recall memory.
Yeah.
But most memory is implicit. It's just in our bodies. It's somatic memory. It's and there's an intelligence behind that, which it responds to our environment before we ever have to think about responding to our environment.
Right.
And it remembers that which is safe and that which is threatening.
There's you're helping me remember another audiobook that I so love, which is a lecture series, and it's Michael A. Singer. I don't know if you've read his work, The Surrender Experiment and Untethered Soul, but he does this lecture series off of that called Living from a Place of Surrender. And there's this one part where he talks about the idea of trauma and triggers, if you want to call them triggers, or I'm trying to get away from triggers. I don't love that word so much because it is very it reminds me of a gun, but
I say response.
Yeah, or activation.
Yeah.
But he talks about, for example, the first time you saw a snake, it didn't mean anything scary. Right? It was just a neutral object. And then depending on what the snake did, same as a butterfly, but depending on what the item, how it interfaced with you or how you interfaced with it, you developed a schema, you developed a set of stories around this. So with the snake, there's a negative reaction or emotional response that gets blueprinted into your body and stored there. And then the next time you see a snake, this is what you're saying, the conditioning's already there for you to tense up inside your body before you see the snake. And this is the kicker, because not only is it the snake, it's anything that looks like a snake. So it's the garden hose, right? And this and this and that. And suddenly we're making all these adjustments within our lives to avoid anything that remotely looks like snake. And I'm using snake as a funny example.
It's simple. It's a great example. And what's interesting is that these are responses that we don't think about.
Yes.
They're not in our mind. They're in our body.
Right.
And it's that way so that we can survive as a species.
Right.
And snake or spider, both of those have a genetic imprint of sorts. Our body, our hardware comes pre-programmed with this software information.
Right.
So that we can survive. So it's happened enough times over enough generations across a long enough period of time that our organism remembers snake might be dangerous.
Right.
Spider might be dangerous.
In the same way that getting left alone is dangerous. And how that is carried within the DNA as well.
Yep.
Because being abandoned, being alone, being isolated from the tribe meant death.
That's right. Yeah. In the course that Ariana and I run, we break it down into 3 basic human needs. Tony Robbins has more, but we think that they all fit into these 3. Safety and security. So safety, belonging, and dignity. So when any of these things are challenged, my nervous system, my body's system gets a signal.
Yeah.
And I begin to respond in some way to stay safe, to stay in connection, to continue to belong, right? To retain my sense of dignity. Right? Am I safe? Well, I might be getting the signal that there's a tiger here in the room with me, but there's no tiger.
Right.
But I'm still getting that signal.
Right.
So the tiger's really here.
Right.
It's not here. It's real.
Yeah.
Right? But it's not here. Right? And most of us move through this world with tigers in every room.
Oof.
We just don't know that they're there. And we don't know what they are. And we're not even aware of it. So there's no awareness. And we have these constrictive patterns that shape our bodies in ways that are reflexive and responsive and intelligent.
So step 1 is becoming aware that you even have trauma in the first place. Right.
And how it's impacted.
So moving from that tier 1 of where I was when I said I didn't have any trauma to the next step is that awareness is brought in, and then you can begin to work with some of these things. So can you talk about more what that, like if somebody here listening is going, ooh, I need to work on becoming conscious of what my traumas are and how they are unconsciously patterning and programming and informing every little move that I make around my day and around my world. I don't even know what those things are and how they might be holding me back. Where on earth can I start with a task that feels that mammoth?
Yeah. Well, I would say not starting there. Right. And many of you listeners may be asking yourself a question like that. And I'd say, it's not that we want to point it's not that we want to place our attention on getting to that particular place or to finding the things that are causing the pain. It's more that we want to bring awareness to our behavior.
Okay.
We want to bring our awareness to our emotional responses. We want to
So what does that look like? Like, can you give me an example?
Sure. Well, let's just say something's happening and we're talking, and then suddenly I notice that I'm feeling tight or I'm feeling defensive. Maybe I don't notice it until my voice is elevating a little bit and I'm just like in more intensity with you.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, something's happening. As soon as I have that moment of awareness that, oh, something's happening, I want to pause and bring more awareness to what is it that's happening? What's happening inside my body right now? Right? What's the signaling? I mean, I'm saying what's the signaling that may not be obvious, but what is it that's happening inside of me?
Right.
And then what happened right before I noticed that?
Right.
That might be a simplistic way of attempting to explain something
It's
that's pretty
beautiful,
nuanced.
though. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So the second part of the question was like, I mean, you are someone who has, again, alchemized a great deal of your own trauma. I'm sure that's not been one simple magical step. There's been a variety of things, but even you talked about your sauna membership, and saunas were a really huge part of my healing with Lyme's disease, which I went on a very intensive sauna detox protocol. And I didn't believe this at the time when I was diagnosed, but I now, and through my work with ayahuasca, access some layers that really illuminated to me why I was even susceptible to that in the first place. And it had a lot to do with feeling powerlessness and suppressing myself, and this like idea of suppression and immune response, and how those are autoimmune diseases are intricately linked to that. But yeah, I just wanted to know, are there things externally that can help with people who are traumatized and are maybe feeling that like rather actively? They're in an anxious state, or they're in some sort of response. What are things that can be calming for that or helpful for that?
Well, first and foremost, we want to remember that we are far more animal than we realize. And we have our higher thinking that sits on top of the animal nature, but the animal nature that is us, it governs everything. It runs the show, even though we think our thinking mind is the way, but it's not. So there's something that I like to do on a regular basis. And even as we're talking, you notice that I look around from time to time. If we're ever feeling bits of activation or anxiety, something we can do is what we call orienting. We can simply just look around. And it's not just with our eyes. We engage our neck muscles, let ourselves look around, and take in our environment. Pick out a couple objects, let our eyes rest on them, notice the colors, notice the shapes. Listen to the sounds around us. Can we pick out 4 or 5 different sounds? Can we let our ears really take those sounds in? Can we feel the weight of our body wherever it is, whether it's sitting, whether it's standing, whether it's laying down, or somewhere in between? But can we notice the weight of it and the way that gravity pulls on our body and our body pushes against the earth? And if we're feeling especially overwhelmed, is there a place on our body where it might feel supportive for us to give ourselves some contact? Placing my hand on my leg or on my arm, hugging myself, placing my hand on my chest, on my neck. These are things that we can do that help the animal part of us to regulate itself, to become more organized and more aware of safety if safety exists. So orienting is something that's really natural that we as animals do. When we go into a new place, what do? We look around, we take in the surroundings. And so pausing and doing that throughout our day can be really, really helpful for settling that. Now, I want to circle back around to something that you said. You were mentioning autoimmune conditions and something about the susceptibility to that. And what I find interesting is that what we know now is that the way that our nervous systems organize, there are these constellations of symptoms sometimes. And I may not say this in the most succinct way, but we'll kind of meander our way to the point. Things that look like autoimmune conditions are oftentimes, not always, a result of our body working too hard to manage something, right? And that means that at some point the load becomes so high that the body can't manage it, and it shows up as all of these symptoms that are seemingly random, seemingly unconnected. But most of the time that there's an origin point in our life where some sort of something took place that caused disorganization, and we're more susceptible to other things like Lyme, right? And with Lyme comes tons of different co-infections, as I'm sure you know, as you've been on your journey of healing with this. Ariana was diagnosed with Lyme at 15.
Wow.
She and I both lived in Peru, and part of her journey to Peru before going there was to do this, I think it was like a year-long detox protocol over in Amsterdam.
Wow.
And so she's been on her own journey as well. Maybe you two have a conversation when she gets back in town.
Yeah, that'd be excellent.
But it's pretty normal for us to see like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and things like that showing up when we had difficulties earlier on in life and we didn't have the support that we needed. So to be a little clinical in my definition here of trauma, it's, the lingering psychosomatic response to something that was too much or too fast for our system, for our body to process, right? And so it's not what happened. It's what didn't happen, right? We didn't get the support we needed.
Yeah.
We didn't have the person there to be that empathetic witness. We couldn't protect ourselves from the car that was coming that hit us. We couldn't run away from the danger. We inhibited our tears or our anger because it was more socially acceptable to do that.
Right.
Whatever it might be, but our body inhibited, it constricted around life.
Right.
Instead of allowing life to move.
Yeah, what's coming to mind is just shock. Like I'm thinking about my respective traumas that I've danced with, and the most intense ones were not necessarily the most violent ones. They were the ones that were just so blindsiding, and where there was very little support around their integration. And I'm thinking of different cultures around the world where grief is not as suppressed.
Yeah.
And when somebody dies, how the whole village wails and grieves and holds each other and makes lots of noise and really processes.
Yeah.
And we don't really have that in our Western culture.
Yeah, not so much. We have a tendency to turn away from emotions. Well, some of us, or turn towards them so much so that we get lost in them. Yeah. I mean, there are lots of other things that we can point to when it comes to healing. And I'd say that working with a practitioner who understands the nuance of the body, the nervous system, and the interplay between that and the mind. Somatic experiencing practitioner, a Feldenkrais practitioner. Either of those two things, those are probably the most potent modalities I've ever worked with. And I've worked with a lot of different modalities over the years. But they work with the subtlety, and with somatic experiencing, with Peter Levine's work, it works with the nervous system. And the nervous system is the conduit for all of the exchange of energy and information in our body. It's how our organs talk. It's how our bones and our skin communicate. It's connected, like it connects to the fascia, which connects to everything in our body. And so if the nervous system's sending signals, mixed signals, well, the rest of the body knows that's what's happening.
Right. Powerful, powerful stuff. So you're talking about finding a practitioner, and it feels very natural to ask, is this something that you offer?
I do sometimes. It depends. A lot of my work, I work with a very small number of people every year, somewhere between 7 and 10 in the deeper one-on-one work. And I spend a year with them. But I do have a list of practitioners, and there are many resources that I offer. Ariana and I both, I don't know that I've said this out loud during our podcast. Ariana's my fiance. Yes. She's my partner. We train practitioners as well to work with people, not to work specifically on resolving trauma, but to know how to work with practitioners. I mean, not with practitioners, with humans who've lived through trauma. Yeah. So I do some, to answer your question, long-winded kind of circular response here, but I do some work with some people, but not a lot.
I'm really happy that you're offering this training because the coaching industry is blowing up, and it's becoming increasingly important to be trauma informed. Why? Because you've said it yourself. 100% of us have trauma. And it is my belief that part of the empowered responsibility of being a human being is gently learning to hold our own pain and alchemize it, release it, love it, be with it, free it from our tissues, from our bones, from our beingness, so that we can get in touch with that consciousness within us that is pure, that signal that is always there, that God within us, without all of the constriction and the distortions and the pain and the hemorrhaging that comes with sometimes being in the experience of a human body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, conditioning, right?
Yeah.
We are all conditioned by our cultures, by what's acceptable, to become domesticated.
Mm-hmm.
We're like house cats.
Yeah.
And as a result of that domestication, we resist our most natural impulse to shake off things that are stressful.
Mm-hmm.
The simplest example is, the gazelle will shake it off. If it's, or the impala, if it's attacked by a cheetah and the cheetah doesn't eat the impala will lay there frozen, but will come out of it, will shake, will breathe heavy, and will run back into its life, and it doesn't hold on to that. It doesn't hold on to that experience. It doesn't get scared next time it sees a cheetah. It doesn't get stuck and unable to interact with its tribe.
Wow.
Its body knows what to do, and it doesn't resist it. We do. When people are in accidents, the paramedics strap them down to a board and they do not let them shake.
Right.
But the shake is our natural discharging or integrating of the energy that's in our body.
Right.
It's just a natural byproduct of shock, of a shocking experience. We've got this flooding of hormones, of endorphins, that it's important for our body to have that flooding of those things.
Yeah.
But
you're talking about shaking, and I'm thinking of is it called TRE?
Trauma release exercises, yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit from your gnosis?
Yeah, I think what they get right with the trauma release exercises is effectively fatigue the muscles a little bit so that you can get some tremoring to happen to release whatever the stored charges is in there.
Okay.
Which is what the concept of it is. And I think what they get right is the body's natural ability to discharge that lingering energy.
Right.
But I think where it misses, like a lot of other modalities miss, is that they're heading for the symptom instead of the what's beyond. The symptom is the shake. The discharge often is the thing that people chase, but the discharge isn't healing. The discharge is a byproduct of the pathway to integration. So sometimes discharge occurs and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we don't need to shake. Sometimes we need to stop shaking. Right? And so it's just another way of using some of the nervous system's response to help the body to integrate some form of memory or some form of experience.
So someone comes to you and they want to work on their trauma, and it's tabula rasa, it's blank slate with them. And what are some of the first questions that you're going to ask, or where are you going to begin?
I love that question. Well, everybody's a little different, so there's context. The first is the context of what's bringing them to me. So I want to get to know what's going on in their life. So we have some conversations to begin with. And then once I have a bit of a clear picture of whatever's going on right now, then I have some questionnaires and some forms that they fill out to give me some history, without going into any of the details of their history. So, and this is an important component of this. The medical industry, I think, gets this wrong. We as a people have depersonalized the experience of filling out these forms. List everything bad that's ever happened to you. List all of your traumas. List all of your history. Right? So when we go into a medical establishment, oftentimes we're thinking, okay, let me just list all of the bad stuff that ever happened. That in itself can cause us to relive those experiences. So what I do instead is ask yes, no questions. Have things like this ever occurred? So that I can get a baseline of where we're beginning. The history of a human being is going to tell me a lot about where I begin, but my work is still going to happen in the here and now. We're going to be focused on what's happening, how's their body interacting with the world right now, what are the things that they think are the quote unquote problems, and what do they think they want to have changed. And then from there we begin working. Bringing more awareness to the body's responses to things. And I have exercises and techniques to practice body awareness.
Could you give us one small one quick one of your favorites?
Well, it's what I call, my work is in the field of somatics, and somatics being the fullness of our being, not just our body, not just our mind, not just our emotions, but it's the amalgamation of all of those things, the constellation of all of that together, mixed in with our purpose or our spirit or our soul or that which is greater than us. And so I've broken it down into an acronym: sensory-oriented mindful awareness, SOMA. In my work, there's a method that I'm cultivating, and it's focused around sensory-oriented mindful awareness. So we're very mindfully bringing awareness to our sense of being here in our bodies, noticing ourselves and being with ourselves in that noticing. And then I work as the guide, helping the individual to get closer or to move further away from what they're noticing. And I'm paying attention to what their body's saying to me instead of what their words are saying to me. But an example would be what people might call mindfulness. Vipassana does a part of this well, where we're paying attention to our sensations. But none of these things want to happen in a vacuum. We can do some of it on our own, where we can cultivate more awareness of ourselves. I'll notice inside myself. I'll notice what the sensations are that I notice. This is an important distinction that most of us don't have much skill with in the world. We don't use language like sensation language. We use feeling statements to talk about thoughts. I feel, and then we name a series of thoughts.
Right.
We don't name emotions, and we don't name sensing. So we're somatically, sensorily stunted almost.
Right.
So I have handouts and worksheets and stuff that I give people to help them to cultivate a language for what is it? What's the inside of me feel like?
Totally.
What do I notice inside? What are the sensations that I'm aware of? Most of us aren't aware of that.
No.
And so it takes time to cultivate that.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you're familiar with the book Nonviolent Communication.
Yeah.
This was really my entry level into all of what you're saying, because most of us, I think, live our whole lives thinking that we're expressing our feelings when just exactly what you said, we're just expressing a string of thoughts. Like, for example, I feel that you are judging me.
Exactly. What does that even mean? Wow.
Well, let's unpack that. That's not a feeling, and that's a projection onto another that they are making a judgment of you, which is, that's completely a projection. So it's like, well, what am I really feeling in that scenario? I am feeling tension in my body. I'm feeling insecurity that I'm going to be judged. I'm feeling,
feeling shame.
Yes. Feeling heat.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So there are these different things that happen at the same time, and pulling those apart is so important, right? Because when I say, I feel that you are judging me, your immediate response inside is to say, well, I'm not judging you.
Defensiveness.
Exactly. And and then what happens is there we go.
We're not listening to each other.
Yep, we've lost contact with each other completely.
Yeah. Beautiful.
And so the differentiation piece is so valuable for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to switch gears a little bit. And I want to ask you about your experience, if any, with psychedelics and healing trauma.
My experience with psychedelics is vast.
Go on.
When I was talking with Eric, he asked me a little bit about something. I told him a story about driving across the United States after taking a sheet of acid, 100 hits. This is not something I would ever recommend. It was incredibly irresponsible.
Of acid.
Correct, yes. Throughout the course of 8 hours, the guy I was with and I ate 100 hits of acid.
My mouth is like hanging open right now because 8 hours, 100 hits of acid.
We were tripping for over 15 hours or something.
How could you drive a car?
Like I said, not something I would ever recommend. It's terribly irresponsible.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
so you have some psychonaut level acid experience, LSD experience.
Back in 2002, there was a research chemical that was being experimented with called alpha-methyltryptamine, the shorthand AMT. Mm-hmm. It was kind of like a long-acting version of DMT, dialpha-methyltryptamine, right? DMT is naturally occurring in our brain. It's released during pregnancy and birth and death.
Yeah.
And we use substances, a variety of different kinds, to trigger the release of DMT, right? It can be made from most plants, and so on and so forth, right? So this friend of mine and I, back then, there was a lab, so I don't remember where it was, but through this website, I was purchasing some of these research chemicals, and for quite some time before they were scheduled as, schedule whatever they became, substances, we were purchasing them and experimenting with them.
You little bandit.
I know. Yep. So among other things, there was a lot of experimentation. It began, for me in the beginning, psychedelics were an escape from the world. Mm. They were an escape from my pain. They were an attempt to get away from that which had been too much.
Right.
So to close the loop on the story of my time in these group homes, mm-hmm. I lived in this boot camp like facility. I lived in this boot camp like facility, and when I came home from it, I was right as I was turning 15, and when I came home, I was like, all right, I'm finally home. Mm-hmm. I'm home. And I'll close the loop on this and go back. It's all going to connect to the psychedelic stuff. And that place was crazy. Hallie, it was crazy. I was in the woods. We didn't have running water. We used outhouses. I was isolated from the group for an 8-week period where I lived in a tent throughout the winter, and there was snow on the ground. We were in the mountains in West Virginia. Wow. And they isolated me from everybody. It was crazy. Right? So insane experiences.
What do you mean from everybody?
I was only allowed to have conversations with the camp counselors. Only a few of them. I had to wear an orange vest, and I was separated from the group.
Why? What did you do?
This is an interesting thing. I did nothing. So when I arrived, there was an outpost area that was about a 1.5 mile walk down this gravel road. And there were these little wood chink huts. They were made with wood and with tar in between the wood slats. And the kids had made them. The first round of kids built them. And we would have to hang new tarp on the ceilings and stuff. So I was on a cot. It was like an army cot. And it was a gravel floor. So we would go up to the main camp area, which was about a 1.5 mile walk. And that's where the bathrooms were with running water. It was called the bathhouse. So lots of different stalls. It was the first week that I was there. And I went into one of the bathroom stalls. I was using the bathroom. I looked on the wall, and somebody had wiped poop on the wall. They'd wiped some shit on the wall.
Yeah.
So I came out and passively mentioned it to the camp counselor. Just passively mentioned it. Like, somebody wiped shit on the wall in there.
Right.
Like thinking this probably needs to be cleaned up.
Right.
Not a second thought. As part of the structure of their process, they would call groups if they had something they needed to discuss with the rest of the kids. Mm-hmm. It was, the kids had to vote each other up and out. And these were kids from all over.
This sounds like Lord of the Flies.
It was like Lord of the Flies. It was terrible.
Damn.
So it was wild. It was wild. And this would never be legal nowadays.
Right.
They wouldn't,
yeah.
I don't know that there are places like that these days. So they call a group, and the group gets together, and everybody decides that they're going to tell them that I did it. And I have no idea. And they're like, who do you think? Because you're
brand new, right?
Brand new, right?
Yeah, of course. Blame it on the new guy.
Exactly. And it's the most trivial thing, but I was like, no, I didn't do it. They're like, if you just admit it, you won't get any consequences. And I'm like, there's nothing to admit. I didn't do this. This is absolutely, like, I'm just like, you all are insane.
Yeah.
And so, as part of punishment that they would give to people, they would assign digging stumps out of the ground because we were on this massive property.
This is also like the book Holes.
It is, yeah. Kind of like the book Holes, yeah. Just digging holes.
Yeah.
Only it was in the luscious forests of West Virginia. Mm. I'm sorry, it was in Virginia. It was right near the border of West Virginia. And so they're like, well, we're going to give you, how many was it? Like 7 or 8 stumps to dig. It's like, I don't even know what that means.
What is this currency of digging stumps?
Right.
How big are these stumps we're talking about?
Some of them were medium size, but they'd had these big ones that they'd been waiting to give to somebody. And the kids just, they were thrilled at the idea of making me suffer. So some of them, I mean, I'm pretty big, but I'll show you with my hands.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's large. That's like 100-year-old tree or something.
Yeah, there were, I mean, some of them with 2 or 3 feet in diameter.
Right.
So 3 of them were in a pig pen. And that's where they made me start. And then the last one was enormous, and it was just like a little stump island with a creek near it. I had never swung an axe and dug something out of the ground like that before. I mean, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And for 3 full weeks, I flat out refused to do anything. And they kept giving me more consequences.
How old were you again?
14.
Yeah.
They kept giving me more, and I kept refusing. I was like, I didn't do it. I'm not doing it. And they put me in a tent. They removed my privileges. They removed me from the group. And I was like, I'll live in a tent, whatever. So I had to live in a tent.
Whoa.
Right on the edge of the pig pen.
This is so abusive.
It's so abusive. It's crazy. And throughout that time,
you're so strong.
Thank you.
Mentally,
I'm very resilient.
The fortitude to just be like, this isn't the truth. And
I knew what was right and what was wrong, and I knew that was wrong.
Yeah.
And they didn't listen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, throughout that time, I think this is where I really not lost, but really shifted away from organized religion. Because for me in this experience, there was a lot of that prayer. I was turning to that because that's what I was taught, but nothing happened. I mean, I would find 4-leaf clovers all over the place, but nothing changed.
Right.
So that was the 2.5 months maybe, or something like that. I mean, I was young, so it felt like a lot longer, but it was a long time.
Yeah.
It was throughout the winter into the spring. So after living there, I finally came home. My parents didn't have any contact. We didn't have any contact for the first 6 months that I was there. It was part of their process of like what did they call it? They were, I can't think of the word. It's like remodeling,
right?
Like rebuilding,
curbing your behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So as part of that, once I finally had some phone time with my parents, I had been hit in the head. I've got this flat spot in the back of my head from where I was hitting the head with a giant rock while I was there. This kid clubbed me with a rock and a sock hat. And I finally told them what had been happening, and they came and they removed me finally.
Yeah.
But I came home and I'm like, oh yes, finally, going to be a family.
Right.
And my father was 8 months later. My father's like, I got a new job. We're moving to Indiana. I'm like, Indiana? No. I just got home. And then my parents are like, actually, something's going on with us. I'm like, no, come on. I just got home, back to the family.
Yeah.
And my father began the journey of gender reassignment.
Wow.
And my parents began the separation process in their marriage. Yeah.
Wow. And you were just kind of like going through puberty yourself.
Just coming home. And so I began.
Interesting.
And this is where I started experimenting with smoking weed and drinking. And my parents put the fear of God in me, so to speak, as a turn of phrase, about drugs and alcohol. And so up to that point, I hadn't tried anything. And I mean, I looking back, I'm like, well, I was pretty young,
Right.
15, 16 years old or something like that.
Right.
But I'd been smoking cigarettes since I was 12. And
you're such a badass, man. You're so cool.
Thankfully, I don't smoke cigarettes anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember the first time I got high and was like, oh, this is amazing. And then the next night I had spaghetti and I felt high a second time. Whatever that was about. So, yeah, I mean, I skipped 9th grade because I was in that group home.
Yeah.
Just did like homeschooling packets.
Yeah.
And then I skipped half of 10th grade and was just living at a friend's house. I was going to become a musician. And then we started experimenting with LSD. And eventually I got sent to live with my father in Indiana because my mother didn't want to, she just couldn't. I was like, no, I'm dead. I'm going to be smoking weed. She said, well, just not at my house. And I
so
came home
like,
high
bye.
one night and she sent me on a plane.
Wow.
So when I moved out to Indiana, I really heavily started experimenting with these things. And I didn't know how to manage the leftover experience, the emotions, and everything else.
Yeah.
And on top of that, I was very confused because my father was going through gender reassignment.
Right. I was going to ask you about that too.
And just another layer.
And also how, because you said the phrase you used was, that my parents raised me with the fear of God in me. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering how your father was mitigating that with his transition. It's
really interesting. I don't know how it is that he made sense of it. I think that's a whole other podcast episode where we could sit and really take apart his experience because he's now living as a man again. And 2 years ago, he transitioned back to living as a man.
No way. Mm-hmm. This is wild. I don't think I've ever heard a story of someone transitioning back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, after spending many, many years in prayer and reflection, what I would call meditation, what he would call prayer, what he came to, and without taking away his voice and telling his story for him, he shared with me that he realized that the changing of his body didn't change him. Mm. And the fitting in didn't happen. And as you age, those things are more difficult to keep the change the way it is. And he would rather feel, I'm not going to put it so eloquently as he did, but I think he would rather belong in society socially rather than having to fight against it and manage the internal experience.
Right.
Because he was aware of it being really very much a dysphoria for him.
Right. Wow.
I learned a lot living with him through the beginning and then being there near, as we've been close. So being a part of hearing him talk to me about his experience of that. So while he was going through the beginning of that, I just dove deep into psychedelics. And as you probably know, with psychedelics, we think we're running away, but we're running towards ourselves.
Yeah.
There is no, I don't think there's any turning away from the self in that state. I mean, I think we can attempt to.
Yeah.
We can attempt.
It just turns the volume knob up.
Yeah. And LSD is far more psychological than it is physiological in other ways, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
And so I spent a lot of time psychoanalyzing myself and getting to know my deeper, darker sadness and anger and traumas and the lingering. And I spent many years, every other day, every 3 days, dosing on LSD. The last section of high school, I was dosing regularly. And then that kind of transitioned into playing with that research chemical and tripping for weeks on end.
Weeks,
yes.
So just kind of being in a completely altered state.
Sleeping in an altered state, putting it in, it was like Fear and Loathing. We were, that movie was playing on repeat in the house. And one of the guys was wandering around wearing an American flag as a cape. We drilled a hole, one of the other guys drilled a hole in the ceiling, the floor of his bedroom and the floor to the basement. And he created like a little pulley system so that he could have food brought up in between the floors. It was a rental property. I feel bad for that.
Wow.
Just deep in the exploration and the avoidance of life too.
Yeah.
And on the other side of that, throughout the process, I found mysticism.
Sweet.
And so that was my introduction to personal development.
How did you find that? How did you stumble upon that?
Well, I started pushing against religion, Christianity, and I wanted to learn about everything else that there was. So I began learning about ritual magic, Abrahamic magic, any of the mystic teachings of that, and then that led me to more of the obscure occult teachings, which are really the foundation of all personal development nowadays. And psychology, Jung's work came up in all of that, and so I dove deeper and deeper into as many of those things. I have this folder on my computer of I don't even know how many gigs of books and lectures and obscure scrolls. And
did you ever get back into any of Steiner's stuff after being in the Waldorf school at all?
I read a bit of his stuff too. The theosophy stuff. Yeah. It's very interesting. So many. There's so many. And in that, there was this learning to find the stillness inside. And I remember I was in my early 20s. And we didn't have social media yet back then, but we did have chat rooms.
I remember these.
Chat rooms, that was the social media back then. And so I would Yahoo chat rooms searching for teachers or people that could point me in the direction of where I could go and learn from a master or a mystic. Because I'd read stories about these, but I'm like, where does that exist in the here and now? I want that experience.
Yeah.
And I'd say that I've cultivated a bit of that experience for myself over the past 15 years.
Wow.
So the journey with psychedelics it culminated with, I wouldn't say culminated, but it kind of teetered off for a bit in my late 20s and into my early 30s. And then I had an opportunity to go to Peru. And I was like, I'm going.
Tell me more about that.
It was very serendipitous, coming full circle back to the beginning of this.
As it is.
As it is. So many years ago in 2003, 2004, I started a business with this guy. He and I did all sorts of things together. We experimented with psychedelics and played music together. And the business idea came out of us wanting to share our music with the world. It was an internet radio station before internet radio was a thing. And we had a pretty significant falling out, and the woman that I married ended up leaving me for him. And he took the business and things were just really rough between the two of us for a while. We didn't talk for like 6.5, 7 years, understandably. Yeah.
I'm still letting that land.
And then he showed back up in my life around the same time she did, and both of them.
How long ago was this?
This was in 2000 so around 2012 when they both kind of popped back up and individually of their own accord wanting to apologize. And
were they still together?
Me. They were at the time.
Wow.
Yeah. And in 2015, he and I were reconnecting, and I was going through a coach training, and I was kind of trying out some of those coachy tools on him. He was really struggling. He was dating somebody else. And he was just in a lot of pain, I could tell.
Yeah.
And I was like, dude, you got plenty of money. You make plenty of money. You can work from anywhere in the world. Why don't you go on an adventure? And he was just renting a room, sleeping on the floor out of a sleeping bag, just like a small bag.
Yeah.
Literally not even buying. I mean, he had, 60, 80 grand in the bank, but not doing anything.
Yep.
And a reflection of the discomfort inside.
Totally.
So I was like, why don't you go? He's like, well, why don't you come with me? I was like, well, I mean, I've got clients. I was working with a couple of clients jointly with my mother. She's a psychotherapist. So some of the first clients that I worked with were pretty complex cases.
Cool.
Yeah, it was a good learning experience. So I was like, well, I'd have to rearrange some things. I don't know, man. And he's like, and then I went to a small festival in Asheville, North Carolina. And while I was there, a guy offered me something called chunga. Chunga is a smokable DMT.
I just did chunga for the first time about a month ago.
Yeah. It was an amazingly magical experience. And during the next day, we did a Hopi medicine wheel.
Wow.
With this woman, an elder. And
so what does that look like? Can you paint a picture of the Hopi medicine wheel? There
was a huge space that had all of these rocks that were in this circle, structured in a specific way. I don't know too much about that.
Honoring the 4 directions.
Yeah. And then things in between as well. There were probably, 20 of us, maybe more at this offering, I guess you'd say. And she had all of these different, she had a drum, she had tobacco, she had water, she had rattles, she had all these different things that she wanted people to use and invited them to participate. And she said, who here has a connection to Peru? And I was like, oh, I do. I mean, I thought I had a connection to Peru. I had this burning desire to go and study with these forest people, in the jungle.
Right.
And so she gave me these rattles, and they're made out of the clippings of the hooves. Have you seen them? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The alpaca, I think it's the alpaca hooves. And so she's like, walk around the circle and shake it. It's like rattling. And so we do the ceremony, and I couldn't tell you. I don't really remember much about the ceremony, but what I do remember is what happened right after. This guy came up to me, and he's trying to decide whether he's going to talk to me or not. I'm holding the rattle, and he comes up and he goes like, hey, this dropped off of that. Can I have this? It was one of the hooves. I said, well, it's not mine, but you can ask her. Let's go over there and ask her. And he's like reluctantly comes with me. Right. We go and talk to the woman, and she said, oh, thank you so much for holding these. And she takes the things from me, and I said, hey, and one fell off. He was wondering if he could take that with him. I spoke for him. And she turns and she says, oh, thank you so much. And she takes it out of his hand, and she steps between the two of us. She puts it in my hands, and she says, this is for you. And then she turns around, puts her arm around the guy, and walks him away from me.
Wow.
And he just looked dejected.
Oh, no.
But I'm like, oh, interesting. Okay, cool. This is for me. And so I put it in my pocket. I'm like, all right. And I walk over to the girl I'm dating at the time is having a conversation with another woman whose name is Gabriel. And the two of them are talking. Gabriel's telling a story about following this yogi across the country. And the yogi was like, I need somebody who would be willing to let me borrow their car. I'll fly them to California, and put them up for the week just to do a retreat with me. And she immediately put her hand up and didn't think about the consequences. He's like, okay, you. So he gets her a plane ticket and she flies out. And she's like, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I just knew that I wanted to do this. And I had to rearrange my life to make it happen. And I was like, holding this little piece of a hoof. I wish something like that would happen to me. And so we leave the rest of the weekend was eventful and, relatively uneventful by comparison. And so we leave the event, and as I'm turning my cell phone back on, coming out of the event, I have a voice message from this friend who had shown back up in my life. And he says, I've thought about it. Let's go to Peru. I'll pay for everything.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, he's like, just come with me. I don't want to do it alone. And I want you to be there. And I was like, okay, I will say yes. And so I said yes. And it was frightening. And I was worried that something horrible would happen between the two of us again. And I'm like, well, maybe karmically he's, wanting to repay some sort of something, maybe some unconscious need to do that. I was like, okay, I'm just going to say yes because this kind of an opportunity doesn't show up out of the blue for nothing. And so I did, and we spent 3 months there the first time, and it was like anything you might read about in an adventure novel. We showed up, and he was convinced that he did not want to have a place to stay the first night. So we get to the airport, and we're like, "Well, just use the internet," and you get 5 free minutes of internet there. And so we download the localized version of Google Maps, and he picks a place that's seemingly close to the airport. I don't know if you've ever been to Lima, Peru, but the area near the airport in Lima, Peru is just not the best area to stay.
Boy.
So he doesn't want to use one of the secure taxi drivers because they cost like 10 or 15 soles more, which is like $5 or something more. I don't know. It's minimal. And
this is your friend with 60 to 80 grand in the bank.
He's got money, but he's like Scrooge.
Yeah.
To the nth degree. It's pretty amazing. So there was me, who's this adventurous, curious, like open, free, feeling human, and then there's him, who's just very rigid and tight and constrictive and drinking and smoking, and I'm not doing any of that stuff anymore.
Yeah.
Before going, he and I had probably one of the most intense mushroom experiences I've ever had on an island off the coast of the U.S. We both took 10 grams of mushrooms together, and that was a whole different level of ego disillusion and stuff. But so we get into this taxi, which is like a sidekick. One of the doors doesn't open, and it's missing a window.
Perfect.
We've got...
This must be my ride.
Yeah. Oh, man. It was
Valiant steed.
Oh, man. And so we had our guitars, we had 2 backpacks, and we had microphones and a little Zoom recorder and camera gear. And I was dedicated to like filming conversations with people, asking them about the meaning of happiness. And I'm just freaking out. This is my first time out of the country.
Really? Ever?
It was, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
How old again? Remind me.
Let's see.
Getting the timeline.
It was 2015. I'll be 39 this year. So we back up from 21 to 15, 6 years ago.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just like, oh man, this is not good. And he starts taking us down this road, and the roads are falling apart. The buildings have, some of which have not been repaired since the war in the 90s and since earthquake stuff. And like any other third world country, this is relatively normal for them. Mm-hmm. But for me, from a developed country, it was just like very disorienting and a little bit frightening. So we drive down this road and we come up to these gates, and they're massive. They've like 3 stories tall. In front of one of them is a burned up car, no longer on fire, but clearly it had burned up, and the gate is ajar enough that the little vehicle can drive through on the gravel road down this road, and it's not lit.
So you're feeling super safe.
Totally safe, yeah. Yeah. I'm like, what the fuck are we doing? Where are we going? What is happening right now? And we drive down the road and we stop in front of the only painted house on the street. And it happens to be the hostel that he found on TripAdvisor.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So we get out and he starts haggling or attempting to haggle. He doesn't speak Spanish and the driver doesn't speak English. So the driver's like, I think he said 40 or 60 soles and it was supposed to be like 14. And so they're like back and forth, attempting to communicate. And Brian, his name was Brian, he wanted a deal. He really wanted a deal. He was not happy that this guy was asking for that much money.
Right.
And the guy from inside the hostel comes in and he said, come inside.
Yeah.
Because we're like standing out on the street and people are looking at us and we have all this gear with us. And meanwhile, another car pulls up and a guy gets out. And, from my perspective, he looked Peruvian. He was wearing baggy sweatshirt and some baggy sweatpants. And he looks at us and he walks in.
To the same hostel.
Into the same hostel. So we get inside and the guy turns to me and he goes, I'm like, wait a minute, this guy looks familiar. He was on the connecting flight from San Salvador, El Salvador to Lima, Peru that we were on. And we had caught each other's eyes on the flight. We had just kind of walking past each other at one point. I don't know if he was walking to the bathroom, I was walking to the bathroom, but we had noticed each other. And he says, were you just on the flight coming into Lima? And I was like, yeah. He's like, oh, I was too. And I'm like, oh, fuck, you speak English. This is great.
Right.
And he speaks fluent Spanish. So he negotiates his room. He helps us to get some water. And it turns out that he's in the country to cook ayahuasca. And he owns a plot of land that was 13 acres just off in the Amazon in this place called Tamxiacu, which is, I think it's a little south of Iquitos, a couple hours by boat. So we start talking, and as the magic of the universe would have it, we happened to be at the right hostel at the right time, and he invites us down because that was why we were there. So we spent 2 weeks in Lima, kind of wandering around Lima and adjusting. We were in a high rise in Miraflores, which was, it's beautiful and it's a lot safer for gringos.
Right.
And then we went down to Iquitos, and I fell in love in Iquitos. And I was just like, man, this place is wild, but it's amazing.
Yeah.
And so we spent a bunch of time in the jungle, and we met a bunch of the owners of a variety of different ayahuasca retreat centers while we were down there. And I came back to the States. I was like, well, I'm going to go back to the States, and I sold a bunch of my belongings, and I transitioned a couple clients to virtual work, and I decided to go back to Peru. And so I spent the next 7 months living in Peru and back and forth between various different places in the jungle. And then
different ayahuasca centers.
Yeah.
Studying, training.
So my first experience was with mestizo. So I got to hear the chacapa, the leaf thing, fan thing, and some beautiful songs. And I recorded, it's like 26 hours of a variety of different ceremonies and stuff like that. And then I got to spend some time with some of the maestros from the Ayahuasca Foundation, or that they work with, who are Shipibo elders, and work with the Noya Rao diets. And I did a variety of different
plant diets.
I did some plant diets and a 12-day fast, all water fast, and some other purgatives and cleansing things and stuff like that. Yeah. It was a wild experience and amazing.
Yeah.
I'm glad I did it.
Yeah.
And with the vantage point that I have nowadays of understanding the function of the nervous system, I'd say I did too much, too fast. And for Westerners, I don't recommend it anymore. I recommend other things first so that we have the resilience to be able to hold the magnitude of the experience. So if trauma is anything that's too much or too fast for us to process, then psychedelics can be traumatic.
Yes.
And I had a traumatic experience in one of those places with ayahuasca.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I just didn't have the support that I needed in the moment and the reassurance that I needed. I don't know what was going on exactly, but they weren't medically trained. I had been progressively feeling more sick over the days. So I had been fasting. I started the ayahuasca diet, I'll put that in air quotes here, 3 months prior to getting to Peru. So I removed salt, sugar, fat, dairy,
caffeine,
gluten, caffeine, any sort of stimulants, anything that stimulated my nervous system in some way, shape, or form, sex,
right,
conflict. And I lived very simple and ate very simply before I got there. So by the time I started working with ayahuasca, I was super clean and I was fasting. So during the retreat experience with this guy at his place, I was eating 1 river fish a day and 1 boiled plantain, and that was it. It got to the point that when I started eating other food again, I could taste the salt in cucumbers and I could taste the salt in tomatoes. You know what I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So my body was purging and detoxing, and my lymphs in my arms and in my sides were really, really swollen. And I had a fever that night. And I was like, guys, I just don't think that I should drink tonight. I'm feeling sick.
Right.
And he's like, you need more medicine, because that's often what people will say. And
yes.
And I said, well, I'll just have a little bit. And they poured me a big amount.
Yeah.
And I don't think I was properly hydrated. And so we go into the ceremony. I'm like, okay, this is okay. This is okay. Oh, this is too much. This is too much. And it was just starting. And this is too much became
that feeling.
I couldn't purge. And I eventually laid down.
Retching?
None of that.
You just couldn't. You were just sick.
I was stuck. Like I could hardly move my body, and my heart rate was so low that the shaman was squeezing my arm trying to find a pulse.
It was low.
Yeah. My heart rate was low. Yeah. So my blood pressure dropped.
Wow.
And my heart rate dropped with it. So I was in this, and I can look at it from a nervous system perspective. I was in a freeze state. My body was a bit frozen. I was in a deep parasympathetic dorsal response, is what we would call it scientifically.
Yeah.
Which means that the body kind of goes into this like self-preservation mode. Like,
it's
we're
like
dying.
Sleep mode for the body. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I wasn't able to sleep that night. I didn't end up getting what I needed. They didn't give me water when I asked for it. I asked for salt and they refused. So, I came out of that experience going, wow.
Right.
I believe in this as a medicine to help people. And I see how humanity gets in the way. The lack of understanding, or the pain of that those other people had gone through, the ego of sorts. And so I started getting involved in creating a website for a safety association for all of the centers. And we were going to work with the government, but the same kind of thing that happened the first time I tried to start a business with the old friend of mine happened again.
What is that loop following you, Will?
I think that was my duty to close that loop. It's like fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice. Fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Yeah. And that was kind of one of those moments of, oops. Well,
so this is the same friend?
It was the same guy, yeah.
Okay. All right. So there's the karma repeating itself.
Instead of just receiving the gift and then going my way after receiving the gift, we attempted to create again.
I see. Okay. And from there?
Well, from there, I came back to the States and intermittently worked with medicine, which was how I met Ariana. She and I met, and we spent the first almost 2 months in a little bubble of assisting some facilitation work with ayahuasca.
Wow.
And then we dove into somatic experiencing training. So it led me in the right direction. It opened me to experiences. And I finally got the message. It's like, what is it, Alan Watts? When you get the message, hang up the phone.
Right, exactly.
We don't need to keep calling the same number expecting that we're going to get a different message.
Right.
And for me, that was the culmination of, it's enough.
Yeah.
It's finally enough.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
Wow. That's so powerful. And I really appreciate this aspect of the conversation and kind of tempering the expectations that are projected onto the psychedelic experience, and that it is a tool ultimately, and there can be such a thing as too much, absolutely. And I love the synchronicity of your story. I love all the stars that had to align in order for you to be called to that medicine. And for me, it was very much the same way with ayahuasca. So I say that, I feel called to say that in my heart here on this recording, because I know there have been a great deal of people who have actually gone to drink ayahuasca because of this show. I was speaking with Mel, and I think more than 20 people have gone to Soltara using the Thought Room, discount code and all of that. And I want to talk about making a decision to enter into something like ayahuasca for the first time, because it's a big one. I mean, they're all big.
They are.
They're all big, and they all deserve reverence. But you'll often hear people working with ayahuasca say, there was my life before ayahuasca, and there's my life now. And that is one of the most aptly true statements, and also altogether impossible to describe other than exactly in that statement. So can we talk about that a little bit, like this idea of getting a soul calling to do something versus intellectualizing ourselves into it?
Yeah. I think I felt it. It was back in 2011, 2012, where there was this, it was a sensation in my heart. It was a warmth in my heart. It was like emotion that came with it. I watched a documentary. I think it was called Stepping into the Fire.
Okay.
And the documentary was well done. It turned out that there's some pretty sad controversy that ended up coming of the place that the documentary was made about. But it was beautifully done. But it opened me to the worldview around that some of these indigenous elders hold around the medicine and or the vine and the function that it may play in our biology. The way I heard it framed was horses eat certain kinds of grass to purge, and similarly, the vine helps our bodies to purge in a different way.
Yeah.
And to get back to your question, the distinction between the mind and the soul calling, it's again, I think that distinction between I think I feel and I feel.
What do we do when we get so separate from that voice that is that mantra voice, that deep soul voice, the one that speaks in intuition and small words and phrases and feelings, rather than argumentative voice and shrill rationalizations of the mind? What happens when some of us, and I'm including myself in this, go through pockets of getting so far away from the soul voice? How do we call ourselves home to that?
Well, I think we can do that in just about any moment. I mean, we could even do it right now.
Let's do it.
We just pause and bring our awareness into our bodies. Noticing how we're breathing without changing it. Noticing any sensations that are here with us. Just allowing our awareness to be with ourselves. Is there a tingly sensation? Is there heaviness? Are we moving quickly on the inside? Are we moving slowly on the inside? Are we driving? Are we sitting? Are we walking? What are we doing? Where does our awareness go right now? And if we pause that pause, what do we notice?
Mm.
And we can do that more regularly. We can remember to slow down, to pause, to check in, to feel ourselves. And over time, what some people might call a download, what some people might call intuition, what some people might call spirit, some people might call insight, ideas or knowing or some feeling or something comes, it emerges from within us.
Mm.
It's not always in those moments of stillness when that emerges. It's that the moments of stillness or the moments of awareness make space so that the knowing or the intuition can emerge when it needs to.
Mm.
You know, there's so much we can do before we dive into intense psychedelic work, and there's so much that we can do after to support the integration of the experience. One of the reasons why I love Soltara and what they're doing out there in the world is that their focus includes the integrative process.
Yes.
And how we prepare for something is infinitely more important than how we do the thing. And how we integrate that something is infinitely more important than how we do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because once we drink that cup, we're in for the ride.
Yeah.
It's not something we control.
Mm.
But how we make sense of that, how we make meaning of that, and how we rebuild the structure of us afterwards is so vitally important. And going in with a strong enough sense of self and ego development is really important, because when the ego dissolves, we need to have a place to return to.
Mm. So much is just like waking up in me as we're having these conversations, and you know, I'm obviously being drawn back to my own medicine experiences, and yes, the idea of preparation and sort of going in, and this it's what you said, it's drinking that cup and just being like, I'm in here for the ride now. And it's not the medicine necessarily, you know, as people is like, oh, the medicine made me trip like this. The tripping was happening in you.
Yeah.
The way the thoughts were programming and looping, that was occurring.
Yeah. What
the medicine did was it shone the light and it brought that to the surface. So the struggle, like when it's a struggle, it's because the struggle is living in you.
Yeah, the struggle is being eliminated. As you're talking, there's something that Anthony DeMello talks about, and I think it's a Sufi saying, but I think it's really poignant here. When the eye is unobstructed, the result is sight.
Mm.
When the ear is unobstructed, the result is hearing. When the heart is unobstructed, the result is love.
Mm.
When the mind is unobstructed, the result is wisdom.
Mm.
And so when our awareness is unobstructed, the result is truth. We see, we feel, we can be alive. And in that aliveness, we notice all that we've not been noticing. And in the state of psychedelics, the truth of us is illuminated. And there is no escaping the truth in those states. Now, as much as we try to resist and use our minds and use our bodies to turn away from what's there, our ability to close off our awareness is unobstructed.
Mm. That is so powerful. And you're making me think of a statement that one of my friends, Omar, said to me. He said, I was going through a really difficult time actually integrating my ayahuasca experience. And I was having all these kind of like dark thoughts and a little like paranoid thoughts and about the nature of reality. And then I was questioning my own sanity and not really sure who to talk to about that. And, he said to me, nothing can hurt you that isn't you. And that was hard for me to wrap my mind around at first, but I kept repeating it to myself. I was like, nothing can hurt you that isn't you. So what he's saying is, this is me suffering against, resisting against a layer of myself that I'm not wanting to bring home, that I'm not wanting to claim, that I'm not wanting to allow to be okay, that I'm not wanting to give compassion to. I'm resisting self-love, even in this shadow, even in this ugliness, even in this anger, even in this darkness. Like, this is a part of me that wants to be loved and heard and understood.
Yeah. Yep. So true. It's easy to have a psychedelic experience and to think that the spirit of the plant is giving us a message. It's like believing that a meditative state can help us to access some other life. While it's useful as an analogy, I truly believe that all that's happening is we're dissolving the illusion and becoming aware of that which resides inside of us.
Yes.
Now, there may be this collective unconscious that we tap into, yet that is within us. What's being illuminated is my emotions, my thoughts, my worldview, the archetypes and the symbols and the ways that my unconscious makes meaning of all those things.
Yes.
And I can attach myself to the analogy and assume that it is the thing, but that would be like assuming that the word bottle is the bottle itself. It's like, again, referencing DeMello here, assuming that reading a menu, that the word steak was the steak itself. It's not.
Right.
It's a construct. It's an idea. It's something that we use to define a thing that's not it. And the analogies that we get and receive in dream space and in psychedelic spaces are just that. The language of the soul is symbol.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
The unconscious is simply images or ideas, or it's threaded together like some sort of discombobulated story.
Yeah, it's a desire to make meaning and even, synchronicities, signs, symbols, dreams. These are, I believe, just ways that the soul, the higher self, speaks to us, and we allow ourselves. Because sometimes just letting our souls talk directly to us for some people feels like a bit too much. So we say, oh, it's my guides, or I'm working with a, ascended master, or I'm pulling oracle cards, which are all fine. But I believe it's all just part of this natural human meaning-making process in order to integrate this very wild, life is the craziest psychedelic trip you will ever do.
Oh my God.
It's so absurd.
Yeah. And everything that psychedelics show us or give us the experience of can be accessed through awareness.
Yeah.
We can do it with nothing other than our own trained awareness.
Yes.
I've accessed states that I'm like, whoa, the things have visually changed. I feel exactly like I do coming out of a mushroom journey. Like I feel like I'm in a psychedelic state, and all I've done is become aware of myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we don't need those things, and they're useful.
Right.
And when we feel the call, to listen to that call and to make sure that we have the structure of support necessary to support us to do something meaningful with that later, so that we don't fall apart, so that our psychological structure doesn't come crashing down around us. Disillusion is not the objective. Just like purging is not the objective. Just like releasing is not the objective. It's the byproduct of the journey sometimes. But sometimes we chase the big experience instead of what comes after. And if we can attend to what comes after, the experience doesn't have to be so big.
Yeah, and on that note, like the dissolution of the ego, and we hear this, we talk about this, but I think the ego gets a bad rep. Like the ego serves a very important function, and humaning is virtually impossible without the ego. And if you've ever gone deep enough in some of these psychedelic states to dissolve your ego fully for an extended period of time and come back to earth and then just be like, why am I eating with a fork? Like that level of ego dissolution, like my body doesn't make sense. Like everything feels really awkward and strange. That's when you gain appreciation for the ego. And you're like, okay, it's important to remember that I am soul. And that there is no separation from whatever we call God. Like it's obviously beyond. That's why some religions don't even say the word out loud because they understand it's untouchable.
It's just a concept.
It's just a concept.
The moment that I use a word for it, I've lost it.
Right. Exactly. And so it is important to get in touch with that. I think whether, like you said, doesn't matter how we do it, but it's that same idea of when we accept that we're dying, we're living. We're living, we're in touch with that juicy pulse of life. Everything becomes sacred. Every conversation, every time you touch a person, every meal that you make, every bite that you take, every time that you make love, like it's a prayer. So to understand that that's, at least for me, that's why occasionally and not terribly often anymore do I sit with these medicines. And then I practice embodying that wisdom here in this earthly body, because I know that I wouldn't be here in a body if it wasn't to do just that.
Well, and that's the thing. And you touch on something so important here. How can I have the concept of soul without first being a body? How can I have the concept of the difference or the distinction between soul and body, I and me, the watcher, the witness, the spirit, and so on and so forth? How can I even have the concept of the paradox of the two without first being this body? And so if I live my life disconnected from or dissociated from my body, I'm missing the whole purpose of being here. And so a strong ego, no ego, both are what we desire. Because it's the paradox that doesn't make sense logically necessarily, yet it makes complete sense. I need to be strong enough in my sense of self to not be knocked down by the world. And also completely unattached from that sense of self. So as to move through the world unaffected. Right? And be fully here and alive.
And I think that's like the divine comedy piece. Like the more that you can just bring playfulness in and learn to laugh at your own human reactions and responses to things, that makes the journey a little bit more lubricated, we'll say.
That's a great word for it. I mean, life is meant to be lived. It's meant to be enjoyed. Like, let's have fun. Let's play. Let's find the humor in our humanness.
I love that.
I'm an animal. I am an animal with a thinking mind, right? But it's a process of, like, it's a byproduct of the natural evolution of things. I can perceive time because it helps me to feed myself.
Right.
And so I want to be able to laugh at the comedy of my animal nature.
Yes.
You know, because otherwise I get lost in it and I forget that it's not me.
Yeah. Well, this has been one of the juiciest and most soul nourishing conversations I've certainly had lately. It's been really fun to traverse these realms with you. And, you and I just have so much overlap, from our education to our parents' divorce to the medicine experiences to the interest in psychology and dream work and all of these aspects. So I'm really pumped to know you. I'm really excited that we're in the same city. I dearly hope and anticipate that we will do more of these shows, that we will connect on other levels, and that the synchronicities will continue. I'd like to ask you, for anyone listening, what are your current offerings? How can they get in touch with you? What are the best places to find you, whether it's a website, Instagram, and you can just give all your information here now.
Thank you. I would echo back to you. It's been lovely. And likewise, there'll be many more of these, more to come. And who knows, maybe some creative fun together.
I was feeling that too.
Life is about, well, for me, life is about being in that creativity that just kind of abounds everywhere. So it's easy to find me. I share things on social media. I use Facebook more than Instagram, although I'm kind of a dinosaur with Instagram, I feel, but I'm learning how to use it. So it's Will Rezin, Rezin, and I think both Facebook and Instagram are Will Rezin, and if not, it's will.rezin for Facebook. The current offering, which we kind of circled around a couple different times, is a training program that Ariana and I run called Trauma and Somatics. And we teach practitioners, facilitators, doctors, therapists, coaches, mindfulness practitioners, yoga teachers, just anybody who's a helping professional, anybody who's a human. The process of bringing trauma in... Start that again.
Had a little burp there.
Yeah, had a little burp. We teach practitioners the process of bringing a trauma-informed approach into their work. So we teach everything from nervous system physiology to the science of shamanism. We dip into a variety of psychological processes and just give like a high level on what those look like. And then practical tools to things that they can practice in their daily life. Embodiment practices, routines, routines, and a variety of other different things like that. And that we do 3 times a year right now. We just began our May round because of where we are when we're recording this right now. It began on May 10th, but the next round begins I want to say it's the 27th of September.
Okay.
And so things are open for that right now. Currently, the website is somaticcoachtraining.com. Easy to remember. And any more information that anybody might be interested in, they can find us on Instagram, or they can send us a message via Facebook or via our email. My personal website is awakensoma.com. It's been lovely to be here, really. Yeah. And I answer all of my own emails and things, so I like to be accessible to people.
Wonderful. Thank you again. This has been so very fun. I appreciate you. I appreciate all the work that you're doing in the world, truly. And your wild yet grounded stories.
Wild for sure.
Yeah.
It's through that wildness I think I found my footing, my grounding in the midst of it all.
Thanks again, Will.
Thank you.